Hello gamers and welcome back. I'm Rob, of course, or Warshak if you want to call me by my in-game name, and we're going to be going over the monthly meta, which we kind of talk about all of the most popular decks in Hearthstone. So when you hit that ranked button, what decks are you playing, 90 to 95% of the time? For those of you unfamiliar with how this video kind of unfolds, we go ahead and we talk about each and every class and then the most popular decks within that class. Keep in mind that all of the deck lists are my deck lists. The foundation of the decks are the same because, a Dragon Priest is going to have dragons in it, but whether we play one or two dragons is kind of like, it's not... We just don't copy pasta every single popular streamer's list we find. I make these decks as of my own, and if you don't like it, you're more than welcome to change the decks as you see fit. But the important part is not the actual every single card in the deck piece by piece, but it's more importantly just understanding that if you play against Priest, you're probably playing against, one of these three types of Priests, and how do those Priest decks work? Changing one or two cards isn't going to change the whole core fundamental, what the deck is trying to achieve, more so than just text and text in the deck and not text in the deck. So with that, let's head on into it. Priest is going to be our first class that we're going to talk about, but more specifically the Kazakus Priest, or what people call the Highlander Priest. In my opinion, this deck was okay prior to Knights of the Frozen Throne, but it didn't actually have like a really good win condition besides just outvaluing the opponent, whether it was just cards in hand, life at the end of the game, fatigue, or you just kept clearing off their minions. So with this particular deck, it does fairly well against aggressive base decks because it has a lot of good 1 and 2 mana cards, but what allows this deck to actually excel versus control decks is the new Anduin DK, or should I say the Priest DK card, which in combination with Raza, because you're playing Kazakus deck, turns your hero power into a no mana cost, and instead of healing, it actually does damage now, which is what the new Priest DK does. And it says if you play another card this turn, actually refresh your hero power. So normally you'd be paying 2 mana for your hero power and refreshing it, you maybe max use it 2 times per turn. But now, because it costs 0 mana because of Raza, and it does 2 damage and it refreshes every time you play a card, no matter what the mana cost of the card, you're able to get a ton of value from your hero power and either kill off all of your opponent's minions on the board, deal a large quantity of their life in a single turn over the course of, 5 or 6 turns, which most decks can't deal with that. You know what I'm saying? Like, this deck now has a really good late game win condition, along with being able to sustain in the early game against more aggro-based classes, which is why I think this deck is really popular right now, is because it's good versus aggro and it's good versus control. Its only weakness, I would have to say, is Jade. Just because Jades just get bigger and bigger over time. You can't really stop them unless you're running the Geist. And if you're playing the Geist and you don't play any Jade Druids, it's just a waste of a card in your deck, and it's just really fucking bad. But if you don't run it and you play against any other deck, it's not worth really teching Geist in here. But if you're playing a lot of Jade Druids, sure, feel free to throw Geist in here. But as of now, I think the only weakness is actually Jade Druid to this deck, and maybe an aggro deck that catches you off guard and you're not able to get that early game. But for the most part, this is a very powerful deck right now, and probably one of the most popular Priest decks at the moment. So heading into the next one, again, really popular deck. The Raza Priest, or I should say the Kazakus Priest we just went over, and this particular Priest deck are going to be the most popular, followed by the Dragon one, which will be next. So this particular deck revolves around high rolling your opponent. And what I mean by high rolling is if we can draw Barns by turn 4, if we see there's only 5 minions in the deck, if this deck plays Barns on turn 4, it's going to summon a Rage, which is then going to summon another card at the end of the turn, which is either going to be Ystera or a statue. Or if it summons Ystera or the statue, that's still a ton of value because you've got a card called Eternal Servitude in the deck, which also costs 4 mana. So you play that after Barns, and it's actually going to bring back... you're going to discover a minion that died this game. Since there's only 5 minions in the deck, you're only going to discover super valuable minions, and being able to summon 9 to 10 cost minions on turn 4, 5, 6, 7, however many Eternal Servitude you can create with cards like the Shadow Visions, your Shadow Essence, your Free from Ambers. This deck just basically high rolls the shit out of your opponent by playing very large scale minions exceedingly quick in the game, and there's not a whole lot of decks that can withstand such an assault. If you have Barns in this deck on turn 4 and you follow it up with an Eternal Servitude, there's almost no decks in the game that can handle that unless you're playing against like a warrior. He has a card on the board, they brawl, and then the card lives. But even then, it's still, you can still keep bringing minions back. So I'd have to say this deck's biggest weakness is aggro, but that's why I've actually teched in the double Greater Healing, double Potion of Madness, Spirit Lash, Shadow Word Pain, stuff like that. So this deck actually, as bad as it looks against aggro, it's actually pretty good against aggro as long as you can mulligan correctly and actually get your early game. But beyond that, this deck, again, very high rolly. Sometimes you'll draw all of your minions and then Barnes doesn't get anything, or, you know, sometimes you'll go ahead and Shadow Essence, and Shadow Essence will summon Barnes, and then that's really bad. So it all depends on how you're feeling. If you're feeling lucky, this is the deck for you. So the next deck we're going to talk about is a tempo sort of dragon priest. It's a fairly interesting list in my opinion. It worked out pretty good for me on ladder as people didn't expect it, but now it's actually gaining some popularity because Amnesiac is playing a similar list to this, minus a couple cards. But either or, this is basically your standard dragon priest, but it's a little bit faster because you're able to play like Northshire Cleric on 1, then you play Historian or Shadow Ascendant on 2, Talon Priest on 3, Twilight Drake on 4. You can actually curve out very, very well with this deck, and if you notice, each minion at the particular mana cost is really, really powerful, right? You know, Northshire Cleric, one of the best 1-drops. You gotta look at your 3-drops. You got Cabal Talon Priest that actually buffs a minion by 3 HP and is a 3/4 body himself. Very powerful. Twilight Drake, you know, depending on how many cards you have in your hand, it could have upwards of, you know, 8 to 10 HP. Dragonoid Operative or Cobalt Scalebane, you know, it's either buffing minions or discovering more minions for you in your hand. So very curved stone-esque deck, but for each particular mana cost, you have a very high power level minion. Surprisingly, this deck can outvalue most control decks because of the Dragonoid Operatives and Netherspite Historians, along with the Curious Glimmerroot. The only card that you could take out if you really don't feel like it is Lich King. It's kind of a flex spot. I've been trying a couple different cards instead of it. At the moment, I've actually put in a Free from Amber to kind of give me the fluctuation of whether I need to look for, you know, like the statue or a Lich King. It kind of gives you openness, right? Plus, it's not a legendary. But either way, deck's very solid right now, and overall is actually surprisingly pretty good. So the next deck that we're actually going to talk about is going to be the Control Paladin. I would have to say it's not one of the most, I would have to say the Murloc Paladin is much more popular than this specific list is, but it's still, there's 2 paladins running out. I'd have to say like 80% Murloc, 20% this particular deck. It runs the same way all of the other control paladins have worked in the past. You outvalue your opponent by very high value minions. We have Stonehill Defenders, of course, that can make more Tyrians or Sunkeeper Tarums. We got Spike Ridge Steed, which is just an insane card. We are running Geist in this deck because, again, this particular list isn't really weak to aggro, and it can outvalue most priest decks. Jade is really the only deck that can push this deck to the limits because of the fact they have unlimited Jades. If you hit Jade Idol, is just fucking broken. So Stalking Geese stops the Jade army, and we've added Uther and things like that. So there's really not too much of a surprise this Paladin deck. It doesn't have burst, but it has, you know, like I said, just substantial value. You've got cards like Forbidden Healing, Tyrion, Stonehill Defenders. This deck, once it gets rolling in the late game, it's really hard to outvalue this one. I'd have to say this could go toe-to-toe with the Priest deck we recently, Highlander Priest, and it may actually even beat the Priest because this has a sizable amount of healing with the Forbidden Healing, which can heal up to 20, which is also pretty big. So looking at the next Murloc, or the next Paladin list, which I'm going to go over a little bit more than the Control Paladin because it's a lot more popular, is the Murloc Paladin. Again, a deck that was very good prior to Knights of the Frozen Throne, and it's still good afterwards. And the reason that this deck is good right now is a lot of people are saying it's a very favorable matchup to the Jade. Like any Druid, it does fairly well against, and that's because of the ability to kind of not only Curve Stone, but Gentle Megasaur in combination with having 3 or 4 Murlocs on the board, plus a Murloc War Leader. You're killing your opponent by turn 4 or 5, and that's before a Druid can even nourish or play Ultimate Infestation. So when you're playing a deck that its spikes is at the high, like the very start of the game before the Druid can ramp or do anything, you're going to be able to beat Druid and other control decks pretty easily, because once you hit that mid-game mark where they're able to, you know, Spreading Plague, Dragonfire, Potion, Brawl, bad things happen. But if you kill them before that turn because you've just slaughtered them with little Murlocs, I believe that's why this deck is so powerful at the moment. So if we look at the curve, there's a lot of 1-drops, a lot of 2-drops. This curves into a very powerful 3-drops. You got the Murloc War Leader, but more importantly, looking from the Murloc War Leader, we get Gentle Megasaur, which is insane. Like I said, with the Murloc value, they get Wind Fury, +3 attack, Divine Shield, stuff like that. Super annoying. And then your late game consists of more Spike Ridge Steeds, Bone Mare's Curator, and Tyrion. So you actually have the ability to go into late game, but that's not really where this strength lies. It lies in the top half of the 1 to 4 mana cards, where you're able to basically just destroy your opponent before anything gets started. And it's kind of sad that we're seeing, you know, decks that were really good before Knights of the Frozen Throne being really good after it. Like, it's one of my least favorite things when the meta, it has shifted to more of a control meta. We're definitely seeing a lot more greedy decks and a lot more control decks. But the problem is there's been a lot of decks that really haven't changed, and they're still just as powerful, if not even more powerful, which I don't think is healthy for the game at all, but that's just me. So maybe the next one's going to be Miricle Rogue. Again, a deck that really hasn't changed besides the fact that it's running Valyra the Hollow now, which is a really good value tool. In my opinion, I think Jade Rogue is actually one of the most, like, you cannot beat a Jade Rogue in the late game when they have Valyra Howl. It's just impossible. Being able to play 2 cards of whatever nature at your disposal per turn is insane. I've played many of Priests and many of Jade Druids with our Jade Rogue deck, and we've absolutely slaughtered them once we've been able to make it to the late game. Not that it has anything to do with this Miracle list, I'm just saying Valyra the Hollow is a fantastic card, and it's actually why it's also found in Miracle Rogue, because they're able to play 2 Vile Spine Slayers per turn, 2 Arcane Giants. If you actually wait to play your Arcane Giants until Valyra is out, you actually can make 4, because you can play 1 Giant, and then the card that Valyra the Hollow gives you is a copy of the last card you just played, so you actually get to play another one, and this happens every single turn. But basically, like Miracle Rogue has always been, you start off the game relatively slow, you build up a large hand full of cheap spells, you play the Sherzin. They keep killing Sherzin over and over again because you keep bringing them back, because you're able to play a lot of cards per turn, and you're able to do this through Gadgets and Auctioneer, which says every time you play a spell, you get to draw a card. So if you're playing a whole bunch of cheap spells, you can play, you know, 4 to 7, 8, 9 spells in a single turn sometimes, if you can get your Auctioneer to live and if you have preps and coins. So a very powerful deck. Again, one of the reasons why this deck is pretty good right now is the fact that Druid is very, very popular, and Druid is very... It does not do well against combo-based decks, especially decks that can do they can make a large board or have multiple large minions down on the board, because Druids don't have any single target removal. A lot of Druids are actually running big game Hunter now, due to the fact that they're losing to, you know, rogues who play 2 Arcane Giants before turn 10, along with a giant questing adventure. But besides that, again, Rogue has always been known to do very well against slower decks that revolve around outvaluing, because they just shoot out so much tempo that the other deck just can't really deal with it. So moving to the next Rogue deck, we have the Jade Rogue. This is my specialty deck. I've been working on this for quite some time. This might be a little different than the deck guide one we just went over, because I made some modifications even past this, but this is basically the core of the deck. It's a very, very powerful deck in my opinion. Its only weakness, again, would be aggro, but to any other deck, it performs phenomenally too. I would have to say it's just as... I wouldn't say just as infinite as Jade's, but you're able to fluctuate, because Jade Druid is always just going to summon. Their infinite value comes from just summoning Jade Golems, while this infinite value could be, you know, Undercity Hucksters, Shadowcasters, Slayers, not Ayas, because she costs 6 mana, but Jade Shurikens, Abysses. Like, you have the ability to fluctuate what cards you're able to generate, which gives you a little bit more... a variety, and the games feel fresh, plus the randomness of it. I mean, in our deck guide, we were able to actually steal Malfurion, which was the opposing player's Death Knight, and we turned into the Jade Druid as the Jade Rogue, and it was even more disgusting, because I believe we got Ultimate Infestation in that game too. It was just sickening. This deck is super fun. Again, the Miricle Rogue is probably going to be more popular than this particular build, but keep in mind that Jade Rogue is a thing, and you don't want to underestimate it, because it can do big things, especially the deck guide one that we had just gone over. It was such a fantastic deck and so fun to play. So the next class we're going to go over is going to be Hunter. This is, again, not really a very popular class for right now, probably the least popular out of all of the classes. But this particular list happens to be very fun. I played it a little bit on ladder the other day, and I did pretty well. Again, I focused more on being able to beat and not value, but out tempo control decks. Hunter is not known to be able to make it to the late game. Like, it doesn't, its hero power stops it from being able to make it to the late game. I know the new Death's Rexar dude makes Build-A-Bear and you get to create your own beast and all that good stuff. As cool as that card is, it's not going to beat the Priest DK, it's not going to beat the Warlock DK, and it's especially not going to be able to beat the Rogue DK. So how should we build our Hunter? We should build it to the fact that it has an explosive start. It's got a lot of secrets in it. It has a very powerful mid game with, of course, Barnes into, you know, hopefully you can get Savannah Highmane. I've thrown in Professor Putricide because we have a decent amount of secrets. We've got Knife Jugglers because we run Snake Trap. From there, our late game consists of Savannah Highmane and Call of the Wilds. And of course, we threw in one N'Zoth because why not? N'Zoth, if it brings back Savannah Highmanes, if you're playing against a control deck and you've happened to make it this far, you're just looking for a little extra edge at the end of the game. And that's what N'Zoth brings. Again, this is another deck that I've modified slightly since making this video. Its deck guide should be out soon, but the only changes I made was I took out the N'Zoth, I added another Call of the Wild, and I believe I added a couple more traps to it. But either or, the deck will run relatively the same because it still has the same curve and we're still trying to accomplish the same thing as out tempo whatever deck we're trying to play, with cheap resilient minions followed by, of course, traps that make our opponent play funny, and we drop Savannah Highmane and Call of the Wild and we just call it a game. From there, this is currently the really only Hunter list we're going to find, is some sort of secret tempo list that runs, of course, Savannah Highmanes and stuff. Hunter has been a deck that really hasn't changed at all. There was originally Face Hunter, which was very powerful, but that's always gone away because there's other decks that just beat down faster, like Pirate Warrior. And then a Control Hunter, again, doesn't exist because there's other control classes. So Hunter's in like a state right now where it just doesn't do anything that great. Like, it doesn't do anything better than any other class that already does what it's trying to do. So why would you play a deck that ultimately does shittier than another deck that you're trying to mimic, basically? And it's quite sad, but Hunter's never really been in a good spot the past couple expansions. The next deck we're going to talk about is Druid, but more specifically Big Druid. So just like the Jade Druid, we're trying to ramp, get to 10 mana as fast as possible. When we hit 10 mana, as you can see here, we've got some good stuff brewing at the bottom of the deck. We've got cards like Giant Anaconda, which helps pull our big minions from our hand. We've got cards like Lich King, Deathwing, Tyrantus, Ultimate Infestation, and Rage. So, as we know, Jades take time to grow over time. Meanwhile, a deck like this, the minions you play are just good when you play them. There's no growth period in which, you know, you need your cards to lead up to being very powerful, which is kind of like the upside to Ramp Druid, is that every card you play is just good because it is good. Meanwhile, in Jade, you know, your first couple Jades, they suck, but they get bigger over time. So that's kind of like, why would you play Jade over this Ramp Druid? Plus, we have Medivh. Medivh gives us a staff that says whenever you play a spell, summon a minion of the same caliber. So if you play Ultimate Infestation with Medivh staff, you get a 10 mana minion, plus you summon the 5/5 minion, that Ultimate Infestation, plus you draw cards and gain 5 armor. The card's just fucking broken. Like, Ultimate Infestation is one of my least favorite cards out of this new set because its power level is just far superior to really anything else at 10 mana. Like, if you put that card in any other class, the class that gets put into is just ultimately blown up. But the fact they put it in a Druid, and Druid is currently one of the best class with Jades and stuff like that, it's just not good for the meta. Anyway, that's our Ram Druid. The following is going to be, I believe this is the this is the Jade Druid. Next one was Taunt, my bad. So this is the Jade Druid. It's going to run the same kind of Jade package it had before. Every Jade card in its collection, Jade Idol, Jade Spirit, Aya, and Jade Behemoth. From there, we've actually changed the late game. Before, it actually used to run a double Primordial Drake package with some more early game, but we've actually changed that. We put in I kept Yogg because we have a lot of spells in the deck. I've lowered the Primordial Drake, added 2 Ultimate Infestations and a Black Knight for tech. This deck has everything you need to beat anything. It's got the ability to ramp if you're playing control and then beat them in the late game with infinite Jades because of Jade Idol. You have the ability to go ahead and beat aggro because you've got cards like Swipe, Spreading Plague, Jade Behemoth, and Malfurion the Pestilent, which you can gain 3 armor per turn. It's better. It's almost as good as the Justicar in Control Warrior. So it has almost the aspect of Control Warrior in regards to gaining armor. It has the ability to ramp. It has the ability to draw a bunch of cards with ultimate infestation. It's got the ability to summon infinite jades. Like, this deck literally does everything. The only thing it doesn't have is great single target and AoE removal, which it doesn't really need to removal. It merely just needs to stall, and that's what Spreading Plague does, and cards like that. And then when it summons giant minions, those minions can trade into whatever we want, and then from there the opponent just can't deal with those kinds of things. So if Druid ever got, you know, some like better AoE, like, we'd be so fucked. This is going to be the Taunt Druid. So this is kind of in between an Aggro Druid and a Jade Druid in regards to how its playstyle is. We're still ramping at the beginning of the game, or we can play minions. It's kind of up to you depending on what your mana curve looks like. You still run 2 Wild Growths, you still run 2 Jade Blossoms, and you still run 2 Innervates. You also still run Ultimate Infestation, but instead of summoning Jade, you're able to basically, you're wanting to use Living Mana, Spreading Plague, and your Crypt Lords to get a good taunt on the board, a good taunt wall on the board. From there, you're going to drop your Strong Shell Scavenger, which is going to buff them. From there, you use cards like Bone Mare, which also gives a creature taunt, so there's combos there. And then while you're ramping, you're obviously lacking the card draw, so you have Nourishes and Ultimate Infestation. So kind of your late game follow, your early game and late game follow the same route as the Jades, but instead of summoning Jades, you're summoning creatures that you're then buffing with Bone Mare and your Strong Shell. This is actually probably one of the more fun Druid decks to play, because Jade is just rudimentary, exceedingly boring, because it's just you're summoning Jade, so there's nothing past that. At least with this deck, you have the flexibility of summoning minions or buffing them, when to use your Spreading Plague, and then Bone Marrying which creature and stuff. I don't know. I think this deck would be probably the most fun, I suppose. But anyway, it probably doesn't mean anything, it's still Druid. And then we have the Aggro Token Druid here. So as you can see, it also runs Living Mana like the Taunt we just went over, just to kind of put minions on the board. It also runs, of course, not Living Mana, but Innervate. Only 1 though. I found that 2 Innervates seem to be too much, and I always draw them and don't want them. So 1 Innervate here, but you can put 2 if you want. I don't want to hear, Rob, why is there only 1 Innervate? You always put 2 Innervates. I found that 1 Innervate works great. Because this deck has no draw. Drawing into, like, top decking an Innervate is the worst possible thing for this deck, and then innervating out, whether you're innervating Bittertide on 3 or turn 2, I don't think it really matters there. You're still summoning an 8/8, and if your opponent can kill it the turn after, they're gonna do, like, dealing that 8 damage didn't really make a difference versus every other game where you're gonna top deck that second Innervate. Besides the point, this deck starts off very, very quickly. You basically have a card to play every turn. There's a ton of 1-drops, a ton of 2-drops, a ton of 3-drops, and very little 4 and 5-drops, which means you're going to be able to curve out very nicely. From there, once you get 2 or 3 minions on the board, you can start buffing those minions with cards like Mark of the Lotus, Mark Yashar, Power of the Wild. You've got cards like Crypt Lord in combination with Living Mana, exceedingly powerful, and of course Savage Roar is kind of your blowout. Very similar to Pokemon or Evolved Shaman, which revolves around using Bloodlust and summoning a bunch of small minions. This deck, instead of having Bloodlust, you summon a bunch of small minions, you get to buff them too, and you get cards like Savage Roar in there. So very similar to Pokemon Shaman or Evolved Shaman in regards to what you're trying to accomplish, but kind of does it in a little bit of 2 different ways in regards to just Bloodlust versus buffing the minions and stuff. Pretty cool. Very powerful deck too. Every Druid deck that we had just gone over, guys, tier 1 deck can get you to Legend. There's a lot of questions as, hey Rob, can any of these decks get you to Legend? Every single deck on this list, probably besides Hunter, can get you to Legend if you play it correctly. And again, if you ask me, hey Rob, what am I doing wrong? I can't hit Legend. I have no idea, guys. I haven't seen you play. I don't even know if you're building the deck correctly or playing it correctly. It's impossible for me to say until I look at you play and say, okay, oh, this is what you're doing wrong. So the next deck we're going to look at is going to be the Evolve Shaman. This deck, again, hasn't really changed since the expansion. The only difference is it runs Thrall. I've also chose to not include Bone Mare. I know that's a really popular card for this particular deck, but I decided to actually play the Flame Wreath Faceless instead because of all the Druids. Druids, again, cannot deal with large minions early on in the game, and I can't tell you how many times I've been able to go coin Flame Wreath Faceless on turn 3, and the Druid almost just concede on the spot because they can't, like, they just take 7 damage 2 or 3 times and then they're dead because I'm either bloodlusting or I'm attacking him in the face again. Granted, I know the faceless doesn't really work well with evolve, so just don't plan to drop the faceless and then go evolve next turn. If you've got like the faceless, you've got doppelganger, coin, and evolve in your hand, figure out what you want to do. If you want to play the faceless to bait out some removal, go ahead and do that, or you can wait a couple turns, do doppelganger, evolve, and then they clear the board and then you drop the faceless. You know what I mean? You got to play smart when you have cards that don't have the greatest synergy in your deck, but I found this actually is, I would have to say, just as good as Bone Mare at the point, or at the moment. Maybe in a little bit it won't be as good because everybody that is playing Druid might just switch to BGH. I've seen it a lot, and then BGHing this guy is really bad. But either way, I found it exceedingly useful at the moment because no one expects this particular card because no one has seen it. And that's one of the best points when playing a deck that everybody thinks they know. They kind of count exactly what's in your deck, and then if you play something off from that, it really messes them up. So the next class we're going to talk about, again, there is no control shaman right now. Just looking real quick at that, there's only the Pokemon shaman. There might be some death rattle shamans running around, but the deck is really not that popular. If you're playing against shaman, it's most likely evolve shaman 100% of the time. And the next deck we're going to talk about is Mage, but more specifically Quest Mage. The reason that this deck is so popular right now is because Druid, and I keep coming back to it, guys, Druid, but the reason is over 50% of my games this season have been against Druid. We're pushing, I think it's at 60 to 65% of all of the games I played this season, which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games. Over half my games have been Druid, which is horrible. In my opinion, this is one of the worst metas I've ever seen after an expansion. It's absolutely awful, and I'm looking forward to playing Destiny 2, to be honest. But hopefully it gets fixed. But either way, this is why the Quest Mage is so popular, is because Jade Druid starts off very slow, and this gives time for Quest Mage to accumulate the pieces it needs to destroy you in one turn. It's also called Exodia Mage. So basically uses the whole deck to stall. From there, it generates random cards. When it generates random cards, it completes the quest faster. The quest says it skips your opponent's next turn. So basically you summon 4 Sorcerer's Apprentice with cards like the I'm not even gonna say, I'm just gonna say Molten Reflection. I don't even know how, Simulacrum. I butchered that word. Anyway, summon 4 Sorcerer's Apprentice, play Archmage, or play 4 Sorcerer's Apprentice, skip your opponent's turn, play Archmage, cast a spell for free, generates a Fireball. Fireball costs 4 mana, and you basically just have infinite fireballs until your opponent's dead. There's not much to this deck. Your win condition is the exact same thing every single game. Nothing changes unless you can manage to like maybe outvalue an aggro deck. But even then, most of the time, 99.9% of the time, you're winning through using that particular combo, summoning 4 Sorcerer's Apprentice or 5, and fireballing down your opponent. The next deck we're going to take a look at is my Tempo Secret Mage. This actually does very well against Jade, Druid, and Paladin. The reason I wanted to target Paladin is because there's a lot of Paladin out targeting Jade Druid, so I figured I'd target the target's target. Next level thinking. No, so it has double Spellbender in it, so when our opponent uses cards like Blessings of Kings and Spike Ridge Steed, and it'll target our Spellbender and they'll concede on the spot. It's happened so many times on turn 4 and turn 6 you want to play Spellbender before, because it's just so very powerful against Paladin. It's also pretty good against Druid because they have Mark of Yashar, so you actually can get a 3/5 on your side of the board, plus they don't get to draw a card, which is really nice. So this deck works really well against slow decks because it has a pretty good start. It also works well against control decks because you have cards like Yogg and Pyroblast and double Firelance Portal to outvalue them. So overall, just a pretty fine deck to play if you enjoy Mage and you don't want to play a really, really slow Mage deck. There's also going to be the Control Mage deck, which I'll cut here because for some reason I don't see it in the list here. So here is the Burn Mage list. It's very, very similar to the Control Mage that we saw before Knights of the Frozen Throne. It has a lot of the similar cards like Medivh, double Firelance Portal, double Blizzard, double Volcanic. So again, it follows that same Burn Mage, Control Mage pattern. The only inclusion, new inclusion I should say, is the Geist to battle out Jade Druid. This deck will lose against that deck without this card. Not to say that you can still not lose. It's not to say that you can still not win versus them because they could just tempo out Jades and you just lose, but the Geese gives you a little bit of a better advantage in the late game when you've been able to play Frostlich Janna, which is the other new inclusion to the deck. She's actually able to change her hero power, so it still does 1 damage, but actually if you kill a minion with it, it summons a water elemental that has lifesteal, which is really big because until now mages really didn't have any form of healing. They had the ability to ice block, which allows them to survive a turn past death if they were to take fatal damage, and they also have Ice Barrier, which provides them with 8 armor if their hero is attacked by another minion, but not necessarily actual life steal. They didn't have anything to gain life, and that's where the Frostlich Janna comes in. Great value card, I would have to say, on par with Jiraxis, because of the fact they're able to summon a minion every turn if you can actually kill your opponent's minion, but instead of an 8/8 Infernal for 2 mana, you get to actually deal 1 damage and summon a 3/6 that has a freeze effect built in, and it has lifesteal. So we got to keep into account that it is missing that +3 extra attack that the Dread Infernals have from Jiraxis, but it actually make up for that because it does 1 damage, they have a freeze effect built into the water elemental, and it has lifesteal. So very, very good card, no doubt, and it's definitely going to help this deck continue to be pretty popular mage deck on ladder and be able to compete with all of course the other control decks that have a very value oriented end game, like the Jades and the Priest and stuff like that. So moving to Warrior, our favorite guys, Pirate Warrior. Again, 2 expansions after the release of the cards that made this deck so powerful. It remains a tier 1 deck that's probably the only Warrior deck on ladder you're going to see. I haven't included Quest Warrior because it's not very popular. I think I've gone against 1 or 2 of them this entire season. Control N'Zoth Warrior isn't even a thing. I attempted it. The deck's okay, but it's not, again, very popular. But, you know, 9 times out of 10 when you play Warrior, it's going to be this Pirate Warrior list. And it's, since the release, it's been the same thing. Your opponent goes face. Well, if they don't go face right away, they have to summon their axe and their minions, and then they go face, and they just keep going face until you're dead. Most of the time, they're able to beat you by turn 5 or 6. And this deck, it just does a fantastic job at dealing a large quantity of damage for a very inexpensive mana cost, and it has a ton of value minions such as the Bloodsail Cultist, Frothing Berserker, Korkron, and Captain Greenskin there, and then Bloodsail Raider. I mean, every card in this deck is just very good, and it has a purpose. It's one of the cheapest decks you can hit Legend with, and it's one of the, in my opinion, easiest decks to play. Granted, it's not, you can't just, I don't know, it's one of the easiest. I don't care who you are. If you say, oh, the deck is harder than Control, you're insane. Like, you just can't, like, you think, in this deck, you think for 6 turns. In a Control matchup, you can think for 20 to 25 turns. So you're thinking 4 times as much in a Control match versus aggro match. Granted, yes, you can, a bad Pirate Warrior is going to lose to a good Pirate Warrior, but I would have to say the amount of time that you have to invest into getting a win with Pirate Warrior versus a Control deck, it's not even fucking close. But a great deck, needless to say, it's a great deck to climb ladder with. At the beginning of the season, it always does well because you got a bunch of players playing Control decks and a bunch of fun decks, and you can just play Pirate Warrior and you can actually just ruin their dreams. Just crush all of their new deck dreams. So we're going to be moving to the Warlock class. Yes, the Warlock has been recently released in the Frozen Throne expansion. We've seen it. We're seeing it more and more. And it's cool to see it back because it's one of my favorite classes to play, especially Handlock, but more specifically, this is more of a demon Handlock deck. We actually just recently did our deck guide on this deck, and fantastic deck in my opinion. Can beat Jade Druid, can beat Paladin. Sorry, my voice is killing me. We've been making this video for a while now. Just overall, very good deck. Doesn't have a whole lot of weaknesses. Its one major weakness is aggro decks, more specifically Pirate Warrior destroys this deck because Pirate Warrior just does an immense amount of damage before turn 5. This deck requires it to be turn 5 before it actually starts doing anything, well 4 or 5 because Twilight Drake's on 4. But by turn 4 or 5, this deck, you know, Pirate Warrior can do 25 damage to you, and being at 4, anywhere between 5 to 10 HP against Pirate Warrior is never a really good thing. But its weakness is basically other aggro decks, Pirate Warrior probably being the worst one. Aggro Druid's not too bad because you have cards like Hellfire that can clean up their board, but against Pirate Warrior, not only you have to worry about the minions, you have to worry about the weapons. So on a minion based deck, a minion-based aggro deck, this would thrive. You know, a little bit different. It doesn't do so well, but overall has very good value generation tools. It has Lord Draxus, and it has Blood Reaver Gul'dan. If you're like, Rob, you're fucking insane. Why do you have those 2 cards in the same deck? This deck looks like garbage. I've seen better versions. Go ahead and watch the deck guide on it, and you can watch me absolutely crush other control decks with it, and you can watch me crush aggro decks with it, which is what I did on our deck guide. So again, if you don't like the build, feel free to change the deck as you see fit, but Handlock or Demon Handlock of this caliber is what you're going to see when you're playing Warlock for the most part. There's also another interesting Warlock deck out there, is the Zoo one. I think Zoo Warlock is still pretty bad. It has the ability to high roll you, very similar to the Priest deck we went over, where they're just able to draw very magnificently. They're, you know, discard mechanics, which are really good. You know, they're able to go ahead and play Doomguard, and Doomguard hits the Silverware Golems and stuff like that. But besides that, you know, this deck is very high rolly. It requires you to play against mostly very slow decks. I feel like if this deck were to play against a Druid deck or a Pirate Warrior deck, it would just get slaughtered, because both those decks are tier 1 aggro decks, and Zoo is yet to see its big breakout performance. So I guess it would just be classified as, you know, a lower tier aggro deck. So you want to play against control decks when playing this particular deck. Go on the board early, get as most minions out there as possible, and deal as much damage as possible. But again, it's making a small comeback, which is why I've included it into this list. But I'd have to say the more Demon Handlock is probably like a 75-25 this particular deck, 75%, you know, more the Demon Handlock list. So with that, that's going to wrap up our monthly meta. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, leave it in the comment section below, or if I happen to miss out on anything, feel free to elaborate. You know, it's hard for me to hit every single deck in this particular video, because again, I want to hit the most popular ones. But if I happen to leave anything out, which does happen occasionally, let me know. And if you want to add on anything, feel free to. I'll see you in the next episode, and I'll see you in the next monthly meta or episode, guys. As always, I'm Robert Warshak, and happy whatever the hell day it is. Oh, my voice is killing me.